This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Atom Audio, iZotope, Native Instruments, and Grace Design. You're hearing my voice right now through the Grace Design M201 Mark II mic preamp into the Empirical Labs EL8X distressor mixed through iZotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar, all on Atom Audio monitors. Please check out our awesome sponsors using the links in the show notes. It's a great way to help support this show, and we really appreciate it. Now, get ready to rock.
Working in this field and being a solo freelancer, running your own small business, I don't know how to describe it. It's so many interlocking facets of life. And to kind of get perspective on all of those, I think you need to have outside people say, hey, did you ever think about this? You really love your mix template, but hey man, did you look over here at this thing? This is kind of important too. It's like that kind of thing. This is really valuable.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey, rock stars. Yeah, you. I've got a secret to tell you. Want to know how I get a consistent sound mixing over 1,000 hours of recording studio rock stars? My secret is using iZotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, Voice Enhancement Assistant, and Nectar to make sure every episode of this podcast sounds great. Right now, you are hearing RX breath control, declick, declip, de-ess, deplosive, voice denoise, ozone multiband compression, neutron EQ, VEA, and limiting, all from iZotope. Use the secret code ROCK10 to get 10% off or pick up the new Trash Light along with many of the other free cool plugins over at iZotope.com. Are you struggling to make your mixes sound professional? If your tracks feel weak, distant, or lack punch and clarity, I've got the perfect solution. My free course, Mix Master Bundle. This course will teach you how to achieve pro-level mixes from your home studio using free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. But these techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you use Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or another. If you're ready to make your best record ever, go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started now for free. Find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Howdy, Rockstars. It's your host, Lij Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Nick Krill, an indie rock producer, mixer, and engineer. Nick's interest in the studio began as a teenager when he would spend weekends in a basement 4-track studio with his band, the Spinto Band, a very cool band. Nick spent the first part of his career simultaneously playing in bands and recording and mixing other artists in the studio. In the early 2000s, the Spinto Band gained notoriety and went on to release 4 LPs and tour extensively in North America and Europe. After the Spinto Band went on hiatus, Nick spent 4 years touring and recording with Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah, and in 2018, Nick decided to focus solely on the studio side of his work and now produces, mixes, and engineers indie rock full-time. Some highlights of his recording work include recording and mixing 2 volumes of A Philly Special Christmas, which went on to chart in the top 10 on various Billboard charts and had a #1 iTunes single. Producing and mixing I Can't Handle Change, the EP by the band Roar. This EP now has over 700 million Spotify streams, and the song Christmas Kids charted in the UK. Working and recording as an engineer on the last 2 War on Drugs LPs, A Deeper Understanding and I Don't Live Here Anymore, which I think got you a Grammy nomination or win. Is that right, Nick?
The first record won Best Rock Album, and then on the next one of the songs I tracked was nominated for Best Rock Song.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And we've actually had a chance to talk about that too. So also producing and mixing the most recent Generationals LP, Heatherhead, Nick's been a guest on the show before for episode RSR471. So Rockstars, you can check that out to hear more about his backstory. And we talked about working together with the Spinto Band years ago, which was a lot of fun. Today, we're going to focus on new records, things that's going on in Nick's studio, and how to make an award-winning record. So thank you, and a shout out to both the Sin City Band of Up Your Way and also Robin Eaton for originally making our introduction. Please welcome Nick Krill back to Recording Studio Rockstars. Nick, are you ready to rock, my brother?
Oh yeah, got to.
Got to, man. So it's great to have you back on the show, dude. I guess it's been a few years since we did an interview.
Yeah,
but we chat every once in a while, so we have a little catch up.
Yeah, been a while.
Tell us what's new with you, man. As I said last time, we talked about stuff like you and I working together when you were doing the Spinto Band. We did the album Nice and Nicely Done together back with Robin Eaton, and then interacted with you guys as you did some following records. But you've done a lot of cool stuff since then, and I'm sure you've had some changes in your studio and stuff like that. So tell us what's new over in your world.
Yeah, let's see what's new. I mean, in some sense, I'm just sort of keep on a classic studio rat that I've always been. Trying to think if there's any new changes.
It's probably been a few years at least.
Yeah. So my studio, I have my own mix room, and then for tracking, I usually freelance all over the place. So probably back when we last talked, I was sharing a space with the War on Drugs guys in Philadelphia. That we ended up moving out of that space. So now I'm sort of hopping around. If I'm in Philly, I'm doing stuff at like this place, Elm Street Studios, or Silent Partner Studios in Philly.
That's for tracking.
Yeah. So those are two super cool spots that I love around here. And then mixing is always back at my place. Yeah.
That's a cool way to work. I've had some of that experience in the past, but ever since I built my place, I find that I'm tending to do records start to finish here.
Yeah.
But do you find it's pretty fun to, like, have you gotten to know the sound of those other studios really well, just in recording in them and tracking in them repeatedly?
Yeah, I feel like you start to get familiar with sort of the advantages of each space and what each space is best for. And then you can kind of plan projects about those kind of spots. And then, I don't know, it's interesting. I had a studio for a while, and then obviously was sharing this space with the studio. And now I kind of enjoying being more freelance and just sort of like, contributing to the greater recording community at large, which is kind of nice. Just being able to kind of like, make friends and support other studio owners and, help the community.
By interacting with other studios. Yeah, I think that's a cool way to look at it too.
Yeah, I kind of like that. Especially, I feel as though, more and more these days, sometimes I feel like I'm on a little island, especially if I'm doing a mix project and it's just like in my own studio or even a remote mix project. It's nice to kind of be a part of the community from time to time.
Yeah, totally. Tell us a little bit more about your mix room. Like, are you joining us from there right now?
Yeah, I'm in it right now. It's like, it's a nice little mix room. I'm mixing primarily in the box these days. So I actually, maybe one change since we last spoke was I kind of even pared down my interface to a simple, really nice stereo interface. The RME, what's it called? ADI2 is what it's called. But I've really been pleased with it. It's got a super sweet, just 2 in and 2 out. I didn't really need a ton of inputs here anymore. It's got a really sweet headphone amp that I love. So I'm really trying to like slim down a little bit in that world.
Have you noticed that when you switched out your interface that you could really hear a difference even in the mix just coming out of the speakers, just like a clarity while you're working?
I definitely did. And in the headphone amp, especially on that RME box, it was like it was interesting because I was experimenting with my old one between the two, and it was kind of like a light bulb moment, like, oh my gosh, this is, orders of magnitude. It's given me a lot back than my other one was. So it's
Do
been
you
cool.
rely on headphones a bunch while you're mixing?
I have been a little bit more and more over the last year or so. So part of one of the other reasons I was interested in slimming down my mix situation was just to kind of be a little bit more mobile and being able to kind of like, just work wherever, or if I'm traveling for a project, I can have a little mobile mix rig that I feel confident working on, like, in an Airbnb or whatever. So yeah, there was a couple, maybe a year or two ago, just due to some external circumstances, I had to do a bunch of mixing while I was away from my normal studio, just the way life happened. And so I was on headphones for that, and I just kind of just jumped right into the deep end, like, well, I'm just going to get a lot of this done on headphones, and then I'll be back in my studio and we can kind of assess. And that was really kind of a cool, interesting process, and it worked out. It was an interesting way to learn too, just kind of taking a song from start to finish in the headphones and then listening it back in the studio, and then just hearing like, what was it giving me back? I wasn't necessarily like, oh, I'm going to listen to headphones and then I'm going to switch to speakers like midway through just to see how's everything, because I didn't have that option. But it was actually kind of great. And now it's kind of a fun way that I like to learn something, is just go full throttle in it. And then when I feel like I've completed a musical thought, then I'll check it on a familiar thing. And then that way I can better sort of assess like, oh, what did my instinct tell me to do in this scenario? And like, what do I like about that? What do I not like about that? That kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, the example of that would have been my Bonnaroo Hay Bale studio, where I was mixing, live the bands out of the studio in headphones, and it would go to the mastering engineer, and then they'd master it, and then later I'd hear it back in speakers, and I'd get that sense. I'd be like, oh, I mixed the vocals low or too loud, or the bass is wrong or the bass is right or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to like get a sense of what kind of decisions you made. Did you notice that loud listening in headphones versus quiet listening in headphones also affected your judgment in the same way that it can with speakers?
So I actually don't like to change listening levels a lot when I'm working. I kind of like to pick one moderate level and stay to it. It's like something that's kind of in the medium. So whether I'm on speakers or headphones, I'm kind of picking, sort of calibrating my ears to a moderate level and like rolling with that.
Even in the recording stage or primarily in the mixing stage?
Yeah, that would, I guess, be more mixing. Recording stage, it's jumping around a lot more. It's like if someone's doing an overdub, you might crank it and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was another reason for the exploring headphones too, is just as I'm traveling around to different studios to be able to bring a reference with me that on headphones that, if I'm in a room that's like, oh wait, what am I hearing here? Can I trust this? It's like, okay, well, let me put on these headphones that I know, and you can kind of cart them around and I'll at least have some sort of reference. I recently been experimenting with these Odyssey headphones.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you which ones you were using. That's cool.
Yeah, so I've got these Odyssey MM500s lately. I've really been digging those.
The Manny American headphones. And those are also on, sort of the more affordable side of the Odyssey headphones, right?
Yeah, for sure. They're more expensive than your average pair of studio headphones, but in terms of the Odyssey world, it's a little more affordable than some of their crazy flagship models.
Right. Do you remember, are those headphones that have a moving coil driver in it, or do they also have the electrostatic?
They're the planar magnetic ones.
Planar magnetic.
Yeah.
Right.
So like that's the technology that they use. Yeah, it's been cool.
That's such a great name. Planar magnetic. Has anybody stolen that as a band name yet? Well, that's cool. I remember one of the first records I did with Nielsen Hubbard, and the producer, gosh, it's been so long, Clay Jones, if I'm remembering that name correctly. He brought in headphones into the studio, and I thought it was so quirky at the time. I was like, he's like carefully inspecting everything. But now at this point, it just seems so no duh. It's like, why wouldn't you bring a pair of headphones that you know everywhere you go so that you can know what you're hearing in all these different studio environments.
Yeah, I feel like it's worthwhile to have that reference point on hand. And if I'm in a session, I'm not necessarily like in a weird, like, I don't want to be like an antisocial dude in headphones during a session,
Right.
you know? So I'm not like necessarily just in headphones all day long when I'm working on a session, but just as an opportunity to kind of like just just compare what I'm hearing back. Like, okay, does everything make sense? Like, does everything sort of feel right? Um, and
Yeah.
then I can kind of just go with it.
I've noticed that even in my own studio where I know the speakers, it can be really handy to have headphones um, for some really simple reasons. Like when I'm setting stereo overheads on the drums, I'll put headphones on because I have to like scoot away from the mix position to set the left and right levels. And sometimes it's just really easy in headphones to hear if it sounds balanced. Or there'll be other sounds that are, you just kind of like get a magnifying glass look at like, is there anything weird with the sound right now? Sometimes doing overdubs, there's people talking in the control room and it's too loud and I just can't even hear what the person's saying on the microphone when they're talking to me.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's cool to have them around. I have the Odyssey ones are open back, and then I also have a pair of the just closed back, some of those Bear Dynamics that I'll sometimes use if I need more kind of like isolation from the surrounding space.
Okay, very cool. So then what about speakers in the studio? Have you found particular monitors that always seem to work really well for you?
Well, yeah, in my mixing room, I have sort of three that I jump between. The main sort of full bandwidth monitors are the B&W 805Ss, which I remember I probably learned from you at Alex the Great. They had those. So I've had those. I got them after we finished making Nice and Nicely Done, just because it's like, all right, well, these are the records, these are the monitors we just spent, all this time working on. Like, I'll just get those.
Do they have the turkey drumstick tweeter on top
they
too
do.
and all that?
Yeah, they do. So those are sort of, at this point, it's interesting. The more I get to know them, the more there's things I like about them, things I don't. But, I feel like at this point, it's almost, it's like 15, 16, 17 years or more that I've been using them. So it's a familiar reference point. So I have those as like my main set, and then some NS10s and some Aratones as alternate sets.
Awesome. And then when you're working, have you found that there are specific musical reasons why you'll switch from one speaker to the other that you now recognize as part of your process?
Yeah, there is. So as I mentioned before, I like to keep listening at one main level. So like that's mostly for my sort of full bandwidth. The B&Ws are just set to that sort of, Fletcher Munson sweet spot around 80, something like that, 80, 81, 82.
And is it something you get really like nerdy and measure, or is it more like it's just a feeling when you're listening to a finished record?
Kind of both. So I did measure it initially. So I measured it, and then I measured my switch on my monitor controller to be coming out at that level, and then I have a set of tunes calibrated to a certain level. So like, and I kind of recognize the feeling of the sounds of those songs at that level.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of just like where I stay. And then for the Aratones and NS10s, that is actually the one point where I listen to those dimmed. I always listen to those dimmed. And those are more for, I mean, in the most general sense, it's a perspective switch. So just like, that kind of just in general, like, oh, let me just get perspective, and you hear it in a brand new way, and you kind of, you can take stock of what you learned from that experience.
Right. And it's more like, it sounds like the predictability of these couple of different listening levels is what seems to help a lot. It's funny because when you think about pro consoles and pro, like my monitor station or the monitor ST from Dangerous Audio, they have dim switches.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember if the dim switches are always 20 dB or something like that, but it makes me wonder if that was figured out a long time ago and if they're all sort of following a formula of these two different listening levels.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, for me, it does really help to have one consistent level that I just understand, and like my brain and my ears are calibrated to that, and so that I know when I'm working, if I mix into that level, when the stuff comes out of the speakers and it feels cool to me and like gets me going, I know it's going to end up sort of in a ballpark of where I want the final kind of mix to end up.
No matter what style of music you create, Native Instruments provides you all the instruments you need, from drums, loops, and beats to vintage and modern synthesizers, realistic strings, guitar amps, and futuristic synth pads. I really enjoy recording real bands in my studio, but then adding amazing overdubs from Contact, Massive X, Super 8, Battery, Guitar Rig, or Hybrid keys. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off or get complete start for free today with a bundle of 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples at nativeinstruments.com. All right, let's keep talking about that for a minute because I think this is a really valuable method for people. And Rockstars, I want to encourage you to go listen to Nick's playlist, which is in the show notes. You can hear his discography. And it is killer. I mean, it sounds really, really good. I was driving around in the car listening to your records, Nick, and I had this moment where I was like, I remember a time when we worked together where I felt like I had lots to teach you, and now I feel like I have lots to learn from you. And that's a good feeling, man.
Oh,
it's a real good feeling.
Thanks.
So I think it's worth talking about, what you're doing to have a consistency in your records like that. And I guess consistent listening levels is a pretty smart place to start. So a couple of questions that pop into mind for me. There can be quite a difference between the level when you're mixing and the level when something's mastered.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways to sort of fake it out where you're always listening at what feels like a mastered level. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? And then we'll kind of talk more about how you arrived at your consistent listening levels?
Sure. So I feel as though when I'm working on a mix, I'm trying to get it to a place where I'm not necessarily like, oh, I'm trying to master it, but I'm trying to get it to a place where when I'm done with it, it holds its own. Like I'm not sort of like, oh, now my mastering engineer will help me get it to the finish line. Like when I'm done, is like, I feel confident that this could live in the greater cosmos of music for eternity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm not mastering. I mean, I'm not mixing at I don't think a really loud level, like in terms of modern day louder music. I'm a little quieter than sort of like the louder records out there, but it's definitely healthy enough to hold its own in the modern day music thing. And then for mastering, again, it's more of a perspective thing. Like I trust the perspective of the people I like to master my records, and I'm not really asking them to do a ton more, I don't think. Sometimes they'll come back like, hey, did you ever think what it would sound like if we tried, if this record maybe had a little brighter presentation, like a more pop focus rather than a more sort of like darker indie focus? Like, well, let's try it out. Let's see.
It's not like, hey, what if you saved the bass for the second verse?
Yeah. But yes.
So
oh, go ahead.
Are you ever mixing with a limiter on your mix bus to try and push it up to the louder volume while you're mixing, or do you find that that you have like a nominal level that you're mixing at? And I guess maybe that's your speaker level. It gives you that.
Yeah. So I have my speaker. The way my speaker level is set, like I said, I sort of did the whole nerdy, like, oh, play pink noise through it until you get, this calibrated level of the speakers. And then, as I mentioned before, I have songs that I like to listen to at that level that kind of like give me a feeling of what I like music to sound like. So I have a playlist of, 5 or 6 songs that I'll listen to a lot. And, sometimes I'll listen to it every morning. Like I think of it as like ear warm-ups almost, like I'll get in the studio, like sort of like as I'm sort of maybe prepping a session or finishing my breakfast or sipping some coffee, I'll be playing these tunes and sort of just, getting my baseline ear-brain relationship going. So yeah, and then those songs are actually all at a consistent level too. So if they're songs that are kind of a louder version of a song, I pull them down. So I kind of have that playlist set at a level that I feel like is a healthy level that I kind of like to hear music at. And then because my brain is like accustomed to that, then when I mix, I'm kind of going for that realm.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And so rewinding a little bit, it sounds like you start out with a benchmark,
Yes.
It's like, okay, what's my starting level? And in that case, if you're going to use, did you say pink noise or white noise?
To calibrate the speakers?
Yeah, I think it's pink, right? Because pink is like a little more bass weighted, like a mix.
Yeah, so to calibrate, I can't remember it's almost, you can do it a bunch of different ways. I think you can do full band with pink noise, like C-weighted slow or something like that. But then there's a whole nother way that's like band limited pink noise. Or I went down the rabbit hole with it when I initially calibrated it. But honestly, once I calibrated it, I kind of just set it there and it's been there for years.
Okay, so Rockstars, we of course can just Google that to go in a little deeper into like which noise to choose. But then at that point, when you're playing the noise out of your speakers, I think a way for us to think about it is you're turning the volume up to a point, your volume knob, you're turning it up to a point where it's going to bring the noise loud enough to be in that sweet spot for listening, but it's also not, you haven't like maxed out your mix bus so that there's no headroom left. You're like leaving some headroom. So maybe you're at a -18 or a -12 level or something like that. And then that's representing your benchmark.
Yes, the benchmark. And actually, just for reference, anybody out there, when I initially did this calibration, I was using some guidelines set out in the Bobcat's book, Mastering Audio. It's sort of a classic book. I'm pretty sure it's still available, but there's a nice little section in there where he outlines all these methods that we've been talking about, how to do it with band limited pink noise, or quick and dirty method with just full band with pink noise and an SBL meter.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go do that.
Yeah, do it. It's really cool, and I will say, like, once you set the benchmark, it's really amazing because then you kind of become, your speakers and your mix bus and everything kind of becomes a system. And then you kind of calibrate your brain to that system, and then you can kind of just work. And then when it gets feeling good, that you're in that a healthy realm that you like to be in.
Did you find it? Do you remember at the beginning having a tendency to want to turn the speakers up to make yourself like something, and having to like force yourself to like, no, I'm just gonna have to work that EQ a little better?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I don't know if I ever had that urge, but yeah, I know what you mean. It's like, oh, let me just like put a couple clicks up on the monitor. Now we're cooking.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can definitely be, a false indicator, I guess.
I will say that I did not hesitate to crank it up in the car listening to your records. So they definitely hold true and they sound killer.
Oh yeah, sweet.
Okay, great. So you have that benchmark, you find the pink noise thing, you read the Bobcat's book, you set your level, and then you take that playlist and you bring it down to be at that level so that an apple represents an orange or whatever,
Yeah. so all the whatever the 6 or 7 songs in the playlist are all the same level. So they're not like jumping all over the place.
Yeah.
So you kind of have this like we've been saying, this benchmark, and then the songs, there's a few songs in there that I feel like are really neat, kind of like nice balanced versions, and so it's sort of like you calibrate your ear to that. And maybe it's probably worth, I just want to say this real quick while we're talking about it. The person who really helped me get this playlist cooking, my mentor, John Paterno. So I want to give him a shout out. So like, credit where credit is due. He really helped me dial this playlist in and thinking about stuff like that.
John's awesome. He's been on the podcast before.
Nice.
And talked about working with Chad Blake on records.
Nice.
And other stuff. So very cool. All right. Well, let me see. So we get our mix levels sorted out. I'll comment and say this too, because I think we often get focused on like, what monitors should we use? How do we set up our room? And I do think that stuff is all important. But just to reiterate what you did, Nick, even after I got my room redesigned and I've got the Carl Tat speakers in there and they sound really great, I still need to go through that process of setting a benchmark for myself, because what you're describing is all about setting your brain and your perspective right while you're working.
Yeah, totally. And it's sort of, I think it's like physical training, just like an elite athlete. And that's why I would say like going in every morning and I would play these songs to, set my own mental benchmark, because I can leave whatever was influencing my brain outside of the studio. I can like leave that behind, and then what I'm hearing through the speakers, I know is like where I need to be. That's where my ears need to be sonically.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So even, and like if you just do that every day for 6 months or like a whole year, you just start to, it just becomes muscle memory after a while too.
What are some other aspects of your studio that you've narrowed it down to? Do you use any kind of fader controllers or anything like that? Or do you find that just clicking with the mouse is the way to go?
I do use a fader controller. I use a S1. So I have a S1 and then I have a pretty healthy Soundflow setup. So between the mouse, the S1 and Soundflow, that's sort of my little like command center.
Right on. Well, let's dive into those, because those are super fun things to talk about. The Avid S1 is, Avid's controller surface that talks directly to Pro Tools through Yukon or Uconnect.
Yeah, Yukon.
You're mixing and working in Pro Tools primarily, yeah?
Yes, that's correct.
What are some ways that you set that up? Do you use an iPad as sort of like for the Avid control surface and things like that?
I don't use the Avid control, like the U-Control software so much. I use iPads a ton for Soundflow. So that's where I have all those kind of buttons. But the S1 and Yukon, I'm really just using the S1 surface, the faders, the mutes, and those soft keys at the bottom are my main main thing. I'm using the S1 pretty simply, just as faders and mutes, and then to occasionally make like a special layout of tracks if there's a couple that I want to dig into or something like that. But yeah.
When you say layouts of tracks, you mean, if I remember correctly, when I had my S1 set up, I could create a custom layout and say, just give me bass, vocal, and snare drum or something, and then have 3 faders in front of me.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So the way I always set my mixes up in the same way, as I'm sure we all heard millions of people talk about. But then there might be a time it's like, oh man, this verse is all about, this organ, this guitar, and these backing vocals or something like that. And they may not be next to each other on, in the session. So I have a button, like a Soundflow quick key, that takes whatever tracks I've highlighted and then just assigns them to the S1. So I can
cool.
So I select those and I hit that, and then they zip right to there, and then I can kind of get a balance cooking.
That's an interesting way to do it. So when you want to deal with 3 different tracks in a mix, you would just highlight. When you say highlight, you mean you like select the track name?
Yes, yeah.
So that it's white on the track.
Exactly,
view,
yeah.
Or the track column in Pro Tools. And then you hit the one button, and now your mixer is just showing you those 3 faders.
Yeah, exactly. So
that makes it really quick.
Yeah, it's super cool. And so most of the time I'm really just using it. The thing that's great about the S1 is it pretty much follows your mouse clicks around Pro Tools. So whatever you're working on in the edit window, it'll show up on the S1. So, 90% of the time I'm just letting that follow my actions and, reach up, and whatever I'm working on just is magically in front of me. But then in those moments where I want to dig into a few things that may not be next to each other on the edit window, that's where that quick key comes in super handy. And you can make, whatever you select, whatever tracks you want, and then zip them right up to the S1.
Okay, very cool. Did you ever mess around with any EQ controllers too? Like, the SSL UC1 or any of those kind of tools?
I haven't. No, I'm curious about that stuff, but I haven't. No, I've sort of, I haven't really messed around with that too much. I'm still sort of mousing around in plugins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a funny thing about controllers is like they can be handy, but at the same time, we also just a lot of times just dive in with the mouse anyway because it's so easy to be precise.
Interesting. Like the beautiful thing about the controllers is, I feel like the whole drag on them forever was like, oh, it's just this crazy big mouse. But then once you start using it, it's like, yeah, well, isn't it great to have a specific function for like a fader and a mute? Is kind of the most important thing you could think about when you're putting a mix together, and to have a specific control for each of those things is totally worth it. And then when you get to mess around and, intuitively create a balance with a controller, it really does make you able to work kind of at your speed of thought in a way, right? Rather than like, oh, let me click. Oh, I want to balance these three elements. Okay, well, I know I want the guitar down, and I think I want the organ up. So okay, let me pull the guitar down, and then I'll scroll over here and I'll put the organ up. Like, is that what I wanted? Oh, you know what? Maybe the guitar's down too much, and I go back over. Versus, I feel like the balance is wrong. Let me zip these tracks in front of me, and then I'm just intuitively getting it to there.
Yeah, that's how I feel about having faders. It's been such a great experience to just grab a fader and just adjust it by ear and stop thinking about anything else. Just listen.
Just keep it intuitive, right? Is what's cool. So yeah, then to your point about the plugins, that's the one place I feel like that's the one sort of fatal flaw in so many control surfaces, where the SSL one is kind of intriguing because it is really a knob per function thing on that SSL strip. I can see that being useful. But,
and now they're opening it up to third-party plugins too, so you can use it to control any plugin, particularly any of the other SSL channel strips. It's going to be a perfect match. There was another company also, or is another company called Rock Solid Audio that makes a controller as well that looks like a channel strip, and you can map all the controls to different plugins. It's all fascinating. Maybe you feel this way. Maybe you can comment on it. Soundflow, of course, is another tool that is really amazing. But sometimes when we go down these avenues, you have to just put in the hard work of figuring it out, because you can't even have an answer for yourself about whether it works better until you've really like set it up and tried it out for a while, right?
Yeah, that's true. There is sort of some inertia that needs to be overcome before you understand if this is going to work or not, And there's tons of, it's funny, Soundflow is such a powerful thing. And, there was ways I thought I would use it, and I built out these special ways to like, oh, let me try this. And it's like, oh, well, actually in practice, this isn't as handy as I thought. Where then there's other parts of it where it's like, oh my gosh, this is the most handy thing I could ever imagine. I can't believe I did mix for so long without this, How
often are you using a macro that somebody else wrote versus one that you just wrote yourself?
I guess maybe 60-40. I don't know. I'm like peering over here at my thing.
And do you use one of the little stream decks with the buttons on it, or do you just find that iPads give you everything you want right there?
iPads give me everything I want, and mostly just because, these days there's just like iPads and old iPhones that people were throwing out. So it's like, oh, cool. Let me just hook that up. So I've got 3 now that are just discarded from other people. Like, oh, I got a new phone. I don't want this. Like, I'll take it,
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's set up, the way Soundflow has it now, they have decks that run on the iPad. So it's essentially the same kind of feeling as those stream decks where there's just, banks, little grids of buttons. And yeah, there's so many, there's so many built-in macros in it, a bunch that I use, and then I built a ton of macros. I built a few scripts. I reverse engineered some other people's scripts, and then there's plenty of little freebie things that people make, like utilities and stuff that you can just dig in there. There's a little bit of a learning curve, I know, but it's totally worth it. Like we were talking about before, like mixing at the speed of how you're thinking about something, it just makes that so much easier and makes it possible.
I think it's good to hear you say that there's a learning curve, but it's worth it. Because that I think is a challenge for us in the studio. Sometimes we hear about something like, that could be cool, but is it cool? Like, you're thinking about, a lot of people might be like, should I spend that money and get that mic? And it's nice to have somebody go, it's worth it. Because you got to go through that process, like you said. And I agree with you. The learning curve was, I think they've worked really hard to make the learning curve more shallow, but it's still by nature a little bit steep,
Yeah, by nature. It's like such a powerful tool. You can't help but like, it's so powerful that it's going to be a little bit complicated. A tip for anybody who wants to dip their toe in it, I'm going a few years back, but when I started with it, there was a few videos, like how-to videos specifically on UI elements and how you like using like user interface UI elements, how you can like address those and make those specifically addressable in your macros. And once that clicked, I watched like that one video, like, oh my gosh, this all makes perfect sense now. But until
right, meaning you can start to learn how to program it in the same way that you look at the screen and move your mouse around. You can start to get it to program to do things that you would do.
Yeah, basically, like if you think about a Pro Tools screen, any little spot that you would, like a button you would click with your mouse would be something called a UI element. And then within Soundflow, you can kind of address those UI elements, and that really unlocks. Then once you know all the buttons you clip on like a sequence of actions you want to do, then you can address each of those things in a macro and just build like a step-by-step.
Atom Audio celebrates 25 years of designing industry-leading monitors in Berlin by unveiling the Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a limited time. With the XART ribbon tweeter design, customizable speaker voicings, and SonarWorks integration for room correction, these monitors deliver professional-grade sound perfect for Grammy-winning producers and home studios. Make your studio cooler than cool with the Arctic White A4V and A7V, available for a limited time with the standard extended 5-year warranty at atomaudio.com. Yeah, I got to say, from my experience in doing macros, I also used Keyboard Maestro, and used back in the day, it was iKey and things like that.
Yeah.
But they all take a little bit of learning to do it. But once you get there, it is really awesome to have some special commands that will do a bunch of steps for you. But getting there is a little tricky, and you have to do things like learn the software. You have to choose the software. So that's like a learning curve. Then you have to, once you chose which one you're going to learn, then you got to learn it. And then you have to also pay close attention to yourself and look in your workflow mirror where you decide, okay, I'm now noticing that every time I do this thing, I have to move my hand off the mouse and go halfway across the keyboard to do something. And that's throwing me off. For me, as getting older and having reading glasses, I was like, oh, wow, like every time I have to look down at my keyboard and back up at the screen, it makes me dizzy. So I should like figure out how to avoid having to do that. And it was part of the vocal comping technique. And so then I finally just sat down and made the one button, and it works. And where it basically like slices out the vocal phrase I want, throws it into the comp track, and then moves forward to the next vocal phrase. Nice. And I was like, oh my God, that was huge. That's like it wasn't that hard to do. And it was such a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. It's fun when you get one of those, repetitive actions that you can automate, and it actually is really good for your workflow, and it's kind of really exciting. Like, oh my gosh, I did it.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think another takeaway is sometimes these things come with, presets where it's like it starts out with the whole Pro Tools deck on my Stream Deck. And then I realized like, I don't really like it's great what they built, but I don't really need all those things. What I need is the few things that I need. And so then you just program, just swap out the buttons or get the iPad, which is cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep talking about some other things. Oh, I do have a question for you with the Avid S1 because I was using that too, but I did run into some problems where I would come back in the next morning and and it sort of forgot my configuration of the S1s. Oh, if you only have one, it might not be such a challenge. But is that something you have had to deal with, or has it worked pretty great?
It's worked pretty seamlessly. There's been maybe one or two times, but I've saved my my soft key buttons and my configuration. Yeah, I've saved that. So if I ever do have a weird thing, I can reload it, or sometimes I'll just relaunch Yukon and it'll just come back to life, or restart the computer. I mean, I think 9 times out of 10, if I get into something squirrely like that, it's like a computer restart sort of fixes it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I am running a pretty simple rig with just the one. I don't have a bank of them, so perhaps it's a little easier to deal with.
You remember what computer restarts look like for us back in the day? Like come back 30 minutes later.
Oh my gosh.
It used to take so long to start up the old Macs and load up the Pro Tools.
Good excuse for a ping pong round, right?
That's right. That's right. Good excuse indeed. Okay, so let's see what other stuff is part of your mix world right there. I noticed that there's a bookshelf behind you, for example.
I mean, got to have a bookshelf. If Alex the Great Studios taught me anything, it's you got to have a great bookshelf in the studio, right?
Is it just for having books to read in between mixes, or does it sort of like make the room sound a little better to you?
I mean, in this, it's sort of a poor man's diffuser in some sense, right? So behind that bookshelf is maybe like 2 feet of insulation and bass trap stuff. It's pretty heavy duty bass trap back there, but then that's just in front of it to kind of scatter a little bit here and there. But I don't know, scientifically speaking, if it's doing this, it's probably not doing what everyone expects like a prime root diffuser to do, but it's a little more fun to have a bookshelf.
Did you go through like a real mathematical setup of your mixing room, or did you find that you were able to just like move into a room in the house and set things up in a simple way and just learn how to use it?
I did a bit of both. So it is just a standard room. I didn't build this room specifically to be a studio, but I did go down a few rabbit holes dialing in the acoustics and the treatment of the space. So a little column A, a little column B.
What kind of things do you feel like you want to share with the rock stars about stuff that they should think about when they're setting up their mix room in a house?
I feel like it's really the classic stuff you probably hear a lot of people say, but your first reflections are important. And then there's a lot of, corners are important. And in front of the speakers, I found to be really important. So actually, that's an interesting thing to mention.
When you mean in front, you mean like on the other side of the speakers?
Yeah, sorry, it's like behind my speakers, that front wall. Right. I feel like you hear a lot of acoustics talk like, oh, your rear wall, all that kind of stuff, corners in the rear wall. And it was interesting when I had time to actually do some trial and error in here, like bring some baffles in, bring some treatment in, measure, take it out, measure, and compare and contrast. That was sort of one of the bigger sort of, I guess, surprises was like, oh, wow, there's what I'm doing in the front wall behind the speakers is having a lot more impact than what I actually was doing on the rear wall behind me.
Let's keep talking about that, because I think what you just said is like a really key tip that we might overlook. So for example, if we're thinking about building a room, we might think about, oh, I need to get sound panels. And then next thing you know, you're like, how much do sound panels cost? And you're thinking construction and you're thinking about spreading things out. But what you just said is a reminder, I think, of how simple we can approach this, where it's like, what if you just got 704 sheets, then it didn't make any sound panel at all, and you just bring them in and just place them leaning up on, set them on a chair up against the wall in various spots. Like you can figure out a lot just by putting things temporarily in locations just to hear what the result is, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a worthwhile endeavor if you can have the time and have the interest to do it. I feel like some people's eyes might glaze over when they think about like, a measurement mic, like being a mad scientist for a little while. But I don't know, I'm excited by that kind of stuff. So I was all about it.
No, I think that's fine. I mean, I don't know that people are so scared of that, but it's more like the fear of making the wrong decision about where to put permanent panels in. And like what you said, which resonates with me, is that you can kind of sketch it out at first just by like physically just putting up some stuff in spots in the room until you're like, okay, this works, like your back wall, front wall thing.
Yeah, totally. And I think that was huge. Like sketching it out is a really good example. Like you make a rough mix of your acoustics almost. But yeah.
And then once you know where things go, then you can worry about like hiring somebody to make professional panels and hanging them just right and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, you can always make it pretty later, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But yeah, it's worth experimenting with if you're interested and if you can. And like you say, it's like it shouldn't be even a question. It should be like, yeah, you should do that and just rough it out. See where that's the other weird thing about acoustics is, like there's like laws of physics that don't really change. But it's such a strange thing, the way it interacts with, your room and your building materials, like what your room's constructed of, like what are the floors made of, is it like resonant? Is it like old plaster? Is it resonant, shaky wood that's kind of like just barely hanging on the walls? Like all these things kind of seem to have some interaction beyond the theory. So you kind of, that's where sort of the whole trial and error and sketching it out became so valuable, is because you really got to see in your specific space what was helping, like what wasn't, what mattered, what didn't, like I took some panels like that I was going to put elsewhere. I was like, well, let me put them, they're clearly doing more at the front than they were in the back. So put them in the front.
Yeah, it's always interesting to start learning how to listen for what the effects of room treatment is. I remember early recordings, being in somebody's kitchen and then like getting clever and just thinking, what if we, set up mic stands and put blankets over it and then put this guy singing with his acoustic in a little tent made out of blankets. And then you listen and you're like, wow, that made a difference,
Yeah, it's interesting. It really does make a difference. I feel like those little adjustments to the acoustic space or the mechanics or the acoustics of an instrument have such huge knock-on effects, and I think that makes sense in the mixing room and also in the tracking room. You think about like, oh, let me just put some gobos around this instrument, or let me just listen to this drum and oh wait, it needs to be mechanically adjusted to sound right. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like those little things have such huge knock-on effects down the line.
Let's keep talking about your mix template for a sec. You said you usually set up your mixes the same way. What more do you want to say about how you would set up a mix just to get started?
Yeah. So my template it's pretty simple. I kind of, in an abstract way to think about it, I almost think about it as the template is my control room full of equipment. Right? Like, so in like a classic studio sense, you're like, oh, I'm going to go into the mix room and get it cooking. And like, you'd have this credenza of outboard gear and you'd have a board, and like, that would be the system that you use to make a mix. And that's kind of how I think about my template. So it's kind of got a bunch of my effects returns, the stereo routing, a bunch of parallel stuff that I know, like, 90% of the time I'm going to want to at least try out. A lot of sort of folders, more so to make prep easier. So I can address the same folders each time with macros and like sort tracks really quickly. And then, like I said, the routing, there's a couple subgroups, all that kind of thing. And then, like the effects returns, there's way more effects than I would ever use, but they're there so I can, at stream of consciousness, just, try out. Like, oh, I want a short, bright thing. Like, I have it ready to go and try, that kind of thing.
Do you have the effects enabled, or do you find that it's good to have them in a template but disabled so they don't chew up the computer power yet?
Yeah, I have them enable it all the time. Cause I didn't like, I actually thought of like, well, let me just make these inactive. Wouldn't that be so efficient? But then it was like, I don't want to keep like jumping down to my effects area and activating stuff. It's like, I just want it open and to try it. So, I mean, I've got lucky enough that the computer I'm using is pretty peppy. So I don't really run into any trouble.
Is that its name? Pretty Peppy? Hey,
it is now.
Peppy. Are we gonna mix today?
The Peppy Puke.
What computer do you find useful for doing all the stuff you like to do?
Right now, it's a Mac Studio. One of those Mac Studio Ultras.
Right on.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. It's always good to hear that from people.
Yeah.
If you're like, I'm doing it on a 2012 laptop, we might be like, oh, damn.
Yeah, I was on an old cheese grater for a real long time, and then
me too.
Made the jump, and just need to kind of keep up.
I like making the jump to the new stuff, but I gotta confess, I hate letting go of the old studios. I'm like, this, like the old Pro Tools I had, I was like, this made nicely done. This made the Spinto record.
Man,
like, how can I put this anywhere other than like, on a pedestal?
Yeah. Well, you can be crazy like me and keep all your old rigs as time capsules.
I've been doing that. I'm running out of room for them.
You might appreciate this. A couple of years ago, someone called me to recall something that I did in 2009 on like Pro Tools 5 point whatever. It was like,
and you were able to do it.
I was able to bring it up. It's like
amazing.
Wow. So I was like, yeah, score one for.
Did you actually have the old rigs still connected and ready to fire up, or did you have to like reassemble it?
I had to reassemble it. I had to just bring it into the control room and rehook everything up, but it worked out. Pretty cool.
Right on. I did that with my old Pro Tools rig, but it took over the dining room, and the fan was so loud. God, those things were loud.
Yeah, I kind of keep them hanging around more from like an archival nerd perspective than anything else. I don't know. I was raised by two people who worked in a museum, so I feel like that's just baked into my DNA.
That's great. That's awesome. Let's see what we're, so you've got the Mac Studio for running the sessions. And then do you want to say anything about your stereo bus? You said you'd have your stereo bus set up.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, that's just, I have a few little plugins on there that I usually like to mix through, and they're just ready to go. So yeah, it's kind of.
Okay, cool. Anything you want to share, or
yeah,
you
sure.
have to kill us afterwards?
No, it's nothing. It's nothing really. It's too dramatic. It's just an SSL compressor, an Pultec EQ, and then I always have them on to start with, and then I have a few other things that I may or may not use, like the Manley Varimu. I like the Ampex 102 UAD. The Manley's those, everything I've said so far is a UAD, and then the FabFilter Saturn, I like that on there sometimes. The Plugin Alliance Black Box I have on there to try sometimes. Inflators on there to try, and then the FabFilter Pro L limiters on there to try. I usually actually have that on there most of the time. But yeah, so it's like the SSL and the Pultec always, and then everything else is there to try. Probably gets used most of the time. Sometimes doesn't need it, but yeah.
Okay, very cool. That actually answers, or that begins to answer some of the questions I'm going to ask you later on the show too. So, as far as something like the Pultec goes, are there sort of a standard little bit of smiley face that it might do? And is it just sort of the sound of the Pultec just gives a little of harmonic interest? Yeah.
So I started with the SSL and Pultec. It's such an iconic kind of stereo bus thing. I just went a couple years ago. I started the year. I said, you know what? I'm just going to put that classic iconic chain and just mix through it, just to like learn it, and just to get really familiar with it, because it is definitely a sound that we like. So many of our favorite records have that combination on their stereo bus. So just to become familiar with that sound and what it can do and what it can't, I just thought was an interesting learning experience. So I sort of challenged myself to just use those two things on the mix bus for a couple months.
And do you find that you're changing the Pultec settings all the time, or do you find that they tend towards a certain
I do
combo?
change them. I do change them. I actually start with it flat. I don't do the starting the thing with the smiley or anything. I start it flat, but I do start with the Pultec and the SSL on, because I found that I like when I would get things cooking and put them on later, it would sort of shift things in a way that I didn't quite like. So
it's always aggravating if we do put a bunch of work in and then we try a thing and now all of a sudden it's like, wait, did that change everything?
Yeah. So specifically with like the bottom end, I noticed that it would change the way that felt. If I would engage those after I had sort of like dialed in my kind of drums and bass relationship. So I always have those in, but the EQ.
What about tape machine? Do you find the tape machine also does that changing of the low end?
That changes a lot. But interestingly, I kind of like that. What that does, and I like what the 102 does to the mid range and the low end, but I do like to start with that off. But I don't know why. It's just like, whereas the SSL and Pultec, it was confusing to me to kick those on. For the tape machine, to start with it off for the first little bit makes sense to me. I don't know why it does, but just when I turn it on, what it does to the mid-range and what it does to the mid-range, I feel like I understand what it's going to do, and I'm sort of anticipating that. Sometimes the low end can be like, oh, I don't like what this did to the low end, like the little hump that it does.
Right, the bump, the low end head bump.
Yeah, so I actually have, I think you can tweak that in the plugin, but I also have like a couple little presets in a FabFilter EQ of like I don't like the tape bump as much presets.
No way. That's awesome.
So I'll like kick it on, and like if I don't like the way the low end is feeling, I'll try a few of those, like, oh, let me just dial that back a little bit.
That's super cool. I love hearing that story where it's like you'll use something you dig, but you're not afraid to readjust for it afterwards instead of just choosing not to use it in the first place. I am really impressed with iZotope Ozone. I've been mastering many of my records recently, and Ozone makes it so easy to get a fantastic sound. The built-in mastering assistant helps by analyzing the mix and suggesting all the settings needed for a professionally mastered result based on the genre and EQ curve of your choice. You can even reference a specific song if you want, using simple yet sophisticated modules like clarity, impact, low-end focus, stabilizer, imager, exciter, and spectral shaping, along with powerful dynamic EQ, compression, and limiting. You just adjust the settings to your taste and it sounds incredible. And the magic of master rebalance means you can manipulate the level of the vocal, bass, and drums even at the mastering stage. Amazing. My bandmates are pretty demanding, but now when I send off the masters for approval, they absolutely love the way our records sound thanks to iZotope. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off Ozone or other tools like RX and Voice Enhancement Assistant, or grab any of the cool free plugins like the new Trash Lite at iZotope.com. What do songwriters, music producers, DJs, EDM artists, TV, and film composers all have in common with you and me? We all need amazing sounds that instantly elevate our music to the desired style. That's why Native Instruments is your ultimate toolkit, offering a massive library of sounds for your studio. Whether you're into hip-hop, indie pop, classic rock, meditation music, dance beats, or orchestral arrangements, the Native Instruments Complete Bundle has it all. From drums, loops, and beats to synths, realistic strings, vintage bass, guitars, and keys, it's a comprehensive collection. I love recording real bands in my studio, but then enhancing the tracks with drum samples, synths, and futuristic keys from battery, Contact, Massive X, guitar rig, and hybrid keys, for example. It's a surefire way to make your productions sound modern and unique. Use the code ROCK10 to get get 10% off or get Complete Start for free today, featuring 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples at nativeinstruments.com. Howdy, Rockstars. We're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Nick Krill, joining us from, what's the name of your studio, Nick?
Paper Lab Recording.
Paper Lab Recording. Love it. And we're going to jump in and keep talking about mixing. You ready to jam, Nick?
Oh, yeah.
All right, good. So you were talking about your mix bus, which I'm really glad I asked you what was on there because your answer is awesome and a lot of good details in there. I like hearing about you use these basic things like SSL, Pultec EQ, the Manley Varimu after the Pultec EQ. So like, I guess that gives you additional tonality if you want. And then hitting the tape, because I agree with you. That's like what I grew up on. So that's like the chain that we would mix through.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that, it's like you've got the Saturn and the black box and the inflator and the limiter. And those are all things that sort of add, they strike me as things that add like a modernized quality to sound too, maybe. How do you like to think about those happening after the tape plugin?
Yeah, I kind of think of those as, all of those are sort of saturation devices, not so much the limiter, but the other three. So I kind of think of them in that realm of sort of adding, they can add density and some cohesion. They can kind of add on the stereo bus. I feel like they kind of add some like, the saturation adds some RMS level that, you can get. There's the Saturn has the way that's kind of an insanely deep plugin that like I definitely only scratch the surface of, but like, the way it does, the way you can kind of have it in multi-band mode, the way it kind of like can like have the top end feel, it has a neat thing. Yeah. And then like the inflator obviously is its own thing, like whatever clipping like, that it does.
This is like grabbing, it's like when you're on the airplane and they're like, if your vest doesn't inflate, just put this tube in your mouth and start blowing. That's what it feels like on your mix.
Yeah.
Hopefully you're not sinking though.
Yeah. Right.
All right. Well, let me jump into this question for you. So Dirt, Diamond, Walking Moment, Heatherhead, all those records by Generationals. And many of your records have this great attention to the mid-range, a great crunch. And I remember hearing that from you back when you were making Spinto Band records, particularly the third album. Do you, and I know that when you first had your studio, was it Paper Labs that you guys had as the Spinto Band, or what was the name of the one where you guys were in the garden?
Yeah, we called that the Garden Center.
The Garden Center, yeah. But that, I felt like that was the time where you began to explore that powerful, I don't want to use the word aggressive because we're not trying to make, you're not trying to make, like Metalhead records or something, but like a strong mid-range in your records. Like you're not afraid to make a statement in the mids, and you've carried that to the records you're making now. So do you still like to work with a console to get that? Or do you feel like you used to do a console and now you've learned how to do it in the computer? And is that what these kind of saturation and harmonic plugins help to give you?
Yeah, I feel like I do that. I mean, if we're talking mixing, I do that in the computer now. And I feel as though, back those older records you were referencing, like the Spinto Band ones, I definitely was, part of the aggression of those is probably me just like not understanding mid-range as well. So just like being younger and kind of like pushing things because it was exciting. But yeah, it's particularly like records like the Generationals record or this other band that I think is on the playlist called French Cassettes. Those two bands in particular they were all about that mid-range being like, so a lot of that kind of comes from the artist too. Like both those bands in particular kind of they like the aesthetic to be kind of like mid-rangey. Like particularly like working on the French Cassettes tunes. I remember some of the first passes I did, they're like, oh man, we love this, but like it feels a little too hi-fi. Like we kind of want this to feel a little sun-baked, like a little bit more like that, 70s demo, than kind of more modern indie rock feel. So some of that mid-range that you're describing is definitely coming from the artist too, where they're kind of just wanting that aesthetic, that more kind of like, lower-fi kind of pushed mid-range feel.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, you definitely nail it on your records. Some of them do have a quality that sounds like they're intentionally taken to a different place, sonically in that way. And, I even asked on the French cassettes, medium horny, I made a note about how the vocal mixes sound so clear and upfront, and wanted to ask you, what were some of the things, do you use things like parallel compression and distortion on vocals as well when you're mixing? And, what do you want to say about some of the things that we could explore in our own records?
Yeah, for sure. For vocals specifically, I do use parallel a lot in vocals. I have a series of sort of parallel chains that, like I said, with the effects, like I may or may not use them, but they're each one kind of does a different feeling thing for me. So depending on the song, I'll try different ones. So there's definitely there's probably, I don't remember exactly what I did for that tune, but if I were to guess, there's definitely some parallel stuff going on.
So what are some parallel things that you might throw into a mix template? Is that the way you think of it? Like you've just got these things on deck and you can send something to it if you want?
Yeah, exactly. So like the way I have my vocal kind of section of my template set up is maybe sort of convoluted, but I have the tracks come in, and then the output of that track goes to a vocal sub. That vocal sub feeds my effects, and I have like separate little auxes for like all my reverbs, all my delays I might want, all my sort of special processing I might want. And then that sub cascades to the parallel stuff, which is its own bank of maybe like, I don't know how many there are, maybe like 7 or 8 different chains of various things I can try. And I'm not like using every single one all the time, but I have them on tap to try. There's things, there's some that are like, oh, this one is good for like, oh, I want some more presence. This one is good for just like overall kind of like bringing up the low level information, like bringing up the RMS, kind of like beefing up the vocal. This one is like a classic, 1176 kind of gives that aggressive feeling, that kind of stuff. This one is just maybe like a distortion only. So it's like, I'll have that on a fader.
Are these all things that you just tried individually at one point and thought like, oh, that's cool, and then you just sort of include it in your mix template and you start building up your own?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It was just stuff that I kind of came upon and tried and thought was cool, and then I would be like building it. I'm like, why am I building this every single time I want to do a mix? So I'll just like have it in there, like this is the setting I like, or this is the chain of things that I like, and now it's just there to try. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. And then have you found clever ways to, well, let me think about this. Let me back up before I pivot. So when we're sending things, I think if I heard you right, you've got your vocal track that goes to a vocal folder or subgroup.
Yeah.
And then that might have some sends on it for effects and parallel things. And does that let you have, like, let's say your lead vocal was made up of 3 tracks, that way they can all kind of feed the same thing if you wanted them to?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So like if I have, say, 2 doubles, like a vocal double or something like that, or maybe I get a session where it comes in and it's like, oh, the artist, sang a double of the verse in 2 tracks and a double, of course, in 2 separate tracks. I can feed those all to the vocal sub bus. And then I can feed all the effects from that chunk the same and the parallels the same. And I'll use that as a starting point. And then sometimes as you get in the thick of a mix, you may realize like, oh, I don't want this like, I don't want this to be part of that like lead vocal cohesion chain. This needs to be pulled out and become its own separate thing. But to start, I usually just have them run through that. And it's mostly like a workflow thing. Like I said, like having all my different effects just at a click of a button to try, just snap them on. And then have those,
each one of those effects sends has already got some level on it, but maybe it's disabled so that you just turn on the send and now it's sending to that effect.
Yeah, exactly. They're all like, I just Apple click it to unmute it, like they're all populated in the sends area, and then I just unclick them to try them out.
Right. So in that respect, it's like the effect return might be enabled, but the effect send can be disabled.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, going back to your initial question of having like the effects enabled or not. Like all my effects, like processing boxes are on. Like if you imagine a studio rack, like all the equipment's turned on, but all the sends on the console are at 0. Nothing's being sent to them to start with.
Yeah, and then in the clever way, if you have a series of vocals that are a stack of tracks, whether it's the lead or whether it's background vocals, you, rather than having to turn up a little bit of reverb send on every single vocal in the stack to get it to the reverb, why not just have them all busing to one folder and then just turn up the send from the folder?
Yeah.
And then that way you can enable or disable the effect a little bit or a lot pretty quickly.
So that's kind of how my brain likes to work.
Okay, cool. And then what about things like de-essing? Where do you find that sort of treatment useful? Or like if you want to, do you ever use tools like Soothe or anything like that to like sort of tame the harshness?
Yeah, I definitely do. So de-essing, man. I mean, that's like a whole separate, like there, I feel like that's like a whole season of a podcast just on de-essing. But it's to the effects. The other cool thing, so going back to on my vocal parallels, I have a de-esser in front of them. So like those parallel, more kind of like saturated or heavy compression effects, I'm de-essing those extra before that. So,
before it even hits the saturation.
Yeah, before it even hits those, like,
because otherwise it just goes crazy.
Yeah, so it helps a little bit about, like, as you know, like if you get aggressive with something, all of a sudden sometimes those S's start zinging.
Where do you think they came from, Rockstars?
But and then also too to like, that's another reason why I have my sends routed the way I do, is because I have all my sends coming from their own like aux, so I can actually pre-process those sends to the reverbs or the delays. Like I have a de-esser on those
so you
vocal
can have
sends.
So you'll go from a vocal track to an aux track that is the send to the
exactly. This is where it's kind of convoluted. Like I send to an aux track that's called just like reverb sends, and that the output of that track goes nowhere. It's no output, but the sends of it go to all my effects.
Oh,
and
interesting.
That gives me an aux track I can populate with like a de-esser ahead of the vocal effects, or an EQ ahead of the vocal effects, which is sometimes useful.
Right.
And that way,
same thing. Instead of having to put a de-esser in front of every single effect or parallel thing, you can just put one.
Yeah.
Before it sends to any of them.
Yeah, and then also like I share effects too. So like I don't necessarily want, like if I'm sending a guitar to the same reverb as a vocal, like they're both sending to a plate for something, I may not want a de-esser interfering with the way the guitar hits that plate, but I do want it to tame the S's of the vocals that are sending to that plate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes great sense.
So that way I can kind of like tailor the way my vocal is going to the effects a little more.
I love that. And I it's great to hear you talk about it, because it just reminds us of, like, we don't have to by default make our mixing stuff complex, but there are really good reasons to set up more complex routing like that, and you can arrive at them one step at a time as we work. And that's how we can develop our own mix templates and, start evolving from, I mean, like the starting mix template is every track goes to the stereo bus. There's nothing on it. And
exactly. And that's how it all started too. And then but then eventually it was, I'm working on a session and like, oh boy, I would really like to to tailor the way this vocal hits the reverb. Like, well, let me build up a chain, like a routing situation to do that. Like, oh, wow, that was really handy. Man, I want to use that in every song. Okay, well, I'll pull it in now. And then, so it's like, it is a little convoluted in some sense, but it's all about kind of like being able to tap into various points of the audio at different points along its journey from like track to stereo bus. And like, if you need to like tweak anything at any point, you have an access point to it, kind of.
Yeah. It's like a patch bay.
Yeah.
In the same way.
Yeah. And so
like a good patch bay means you could just kind of insert something
you
in
can
the
just
chain
go in
where you want to.
And I think my drums and vocals are the most sort of like convoluted way of that. But then once it gets down to sort of the meat and potatoes of a song, it's not as complicated. I'm not having one.
It makes sense to me that drums and vocals are the most complicated. And I think it's funny when you think about drums, it sounds like it makes sense to say because they're so dynamic. But when you think about vocals, sometimes it sounds weird to say because they're so dynamic, but it's the same reason for both. Both of those instruments have a ton of dynamic range in the making of the sound, but ultimately in the mix, we might want them to be very, very precise and controlled how they come out of the speakers in the mix.
Yeah, I feel like there's such huge parts of any piece of music, right? Like the rhythm and the melody are sort of pretty like, cornerstones of a piece of music. So they end up getting a lot of the attention when it's time to mix.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's before we talk about more details of mixing, how about organizing the template stuff? What have you learned is a good system for, for example, sometimes I might think, oh, I really need a mix template. Oh, shit, where did I put that mix that I did 6 months ago?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Have you found a really simple way to know where your mix template is and to update it and to know what you're starting from each time and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I just have a separate Pro Tools session that's just NK template, and that's it. It just lives on my work drive. And then every time I open a new session to mix, I have a Soundflow button that imports it. So it just kind of zips it through.
Right. So if you wanted to update NK mix template, would you just open it up on its own and then import some other track from a new mix?
Right. So yeah, what I'm doing, I'm always importing session data from the template session into my work session.
Right.
So if I'm having a song, like say it's like, song 1 ready to mix, and then I just have, say it's 24 tracks, just a multi-track, I would go import session data, click on my mix template session, select all those things that are in that session, and then pull those into the mix session I'm working on. So it's basically all, all the folders, all the auxes, all that kind of stuff gets pulled in.
Do you often start from where you or the artist that you're mixing left off with their Pro Tools session?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I do a lot of the times. And a lot of the times I'll be sent files just as printed waves. Like so I'll just get like multi-track waves. And I do like to start from where they do it, especially like these days, I feel like the production process involves all those decisions of plugins or throws, like effect throws that they've done. And like, that's like the modern version of like, oh, I chose a Telecaster and a delay pedal instead of a Les Paul and this amp, it's like, those are like production decisions at this point. So I do like to start with them. And then sometimes I will ask for like, if I'm not getting the Pro Tools session, I'll ask for like a dry version just as a backup, just in case it's like, oh, this thing has a reverb printed on it, but we could make it feel so much better if we were able to kind of like, put a pre-delay on that reverb or whatever, what I mean? And then for vocals and drums, I tend to always like the dries, just like, again, like we were talking about, like there's such a cornerstone of what's happening. I like to have them raw to be able to start with, and like, going to like your de-essing, like it's hard to de-ess something if there's like a reverb on it or something like that.
Atom Audio is celebrating 25 years of researching, developing, and manufacturing industry-leading monitoring solutions in Berlin. To mark this milestone, our friends at Atom Audio are unveiling a special limited edition series of monitors that will look stunning in your studio and sound as awesome as your music. Introducing the Arctic White A4V and A7V series. Available for a limited time to pro and home studio owners like yourself, the clean, glossy white finish exudes a luxurious feel and will stand out in any studio or home audio system. Featuring the XART accelerated ribbon tweeter design and customizable speaker voicings, the Arctic White A4V and A7V retain the full specifications of the original design. Plus, with SonarWorks integration for automated room correction, you can fine-tune your monitors to your control room's acoustics. Atom Audio's commitment to delivering professional-grade, high-fidelity sound to studios worldwide has made these monitors a perfect fit for Grammy-winning producers in both pro and home studios for a quarter of a century. Now you can bring that beautiful high-fidelity sound to your own productions and make your studio look as cool as your music sounds. Don't miss out on the limited edition Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a short time with the standard extended 5-year warranty at atomaudio.com. So to that note, sometimes people will send us a stereo stem or a stereo track, but it's really just a mono kick drum or something like that. Have you used Stereo Monoizer?
Yeah, I have. That's a great one. I mean, that's like the most handy tool you could have. Like it's so great. Sometimes I'll use that. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, Rockstars, if you're not sure what that one is, Stereo Monoizer is a separate app you can get, I don't know, $30, $40, and you just open it up, point to the folder full of tracks, and it automatically identifies if something was mono or actually a stereo, and then it'll process them and put them into a new folder for you so you can build your mix out of that.
So I will do that sometimes. Sometimes I'll just pull them in as stereo though, especially if there's like specific balances that are really dialed. Like for example, a couple of those French cassettes records, like when I was working on those tunes, like shout out to like Mackenzie and Scott and those guys in that band, they've got such a clear vision, and their choices were just like dialed and made and committed to. So it was like when I got those files, it didn't make sense to pull them apart, like just bringing them in as stereo, even if it was a mono signal, the way it was, its relationship with all the other things just made sense to be there. I was like, all right, well, whatever. I'll just keep this as a stereo.
Yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So let me jump to this. So Heatherhead's Generationals, or Heatherhead Generationals. Talk about that cool sound of the drums on that one, and particularly like there's these cool drum fills that happen throughout the track too. And it just made me want to ask you in general, like when you're thinking about, not to put you on the spot for a particular, like what'd you do on that one, but like in general, when you're producing and mixing, do you sometimes find that like the sound is this cool mix of loops with like real overdub drum fills that have like the wild kind of effects on them? And talk a little bit about how you arrive at that sort of production or that sort of mix sound.
Yeah, sure. I can't remember exactly what was going on that tune, but like that record as a whole, that Generationals record, there definitely were a couple songs where there was like a loop that then a live drummer played on top of, and then like you say, you might even overdub a fill just to make it like a feature. Like it's not intended to feel like has continuity with the drummer. It's intended to feel like this special moment.
I think about like Burning Down the House,
Yeah,
like
totally.
Big tom fills.
Yeah.
How often do you find yourself needing to create that kind of dichotomy between, or the juxtaposition between, the centerpiece kick and snare versus these wild fills? And is there a part of your process that allows you to do that easily?
Yeah, I feel like, how do I know when to do it? It's really like what the song is asking for to happen, you know? So I think I forget how those songs go, but like, for example, a generic song might, oh man, it feels like this fill should be an event. And then,
Right.
so yeah, if there's any special processing for that fill, it might be as simple as, so on my drum parallels I have on faders, I can just like automate some of those up, and sometimes that'll bring out some cool ambience or distortion.
Hmm.
Or sometimes I might, duplicate the fill track and then have those being sent, like, so I can kind of like we were talking about tailoring what gets sent to us effect specifically. I might
Hmm.
duplicate a track, and so I can dial in the sound of that fill and then send it off on its own, so where it's not like affecting the blend of the whole kit, but it's just its own special kind of send. But then
Right. So
sometimes
like
it's
you
just,
might just take the tom tracks and
yeah, tom tracks,
put them on their own track, and then you can do whatever crazy idea you had just when the
yeah,
toms hit.
or a snare track, its own separate track that feeds like an ambience that's like
Yeah.
its own thing. Um, but then sometimes it may be just as easy as like, oh, I'm going to put a send on the tom track and I'll just automate the send up for the one hit, It kind of depends what needs to happen, really.
Do you sometimes find it's useful to just not even be thinking about the final mix, but you're like processing the drums entirely in craziness, and then you're just printing that to another track to see like what accidents you stumble on, and then you just cut and paste that into the production or mix?
That's cool. I should try that. I don't think.
That answers that question.
Yeah, I don't
Because
think.
I just want to try whatever you're doing
Yeah.
for your mixes. That's what I want to try.
Yeah, no, that sounds cool. I have done that a little bit in the past, where I'll like route a drum kit through a synth or something, or like a filter, a weird like a pedal or something, and just do a
Yeah.
print of it, and then we'll just splice into C. But I think if we're talking about more traditionally sitting down to mix a tune, my mind isn't necessarily going there. If I'm more like a producer in a track, maybe my mind would go there.
Right.
And it definitely has, right? Like I can think of a couple, like now that we're talking about it, I'm thinking of this thing I worked on a couple months ago where it's like, oh yeah, the sound of this kit is definitely being sent to some dark echoes,
Hmm.
and that percolation is part of the groove,
So you're finding a way to do that in the creation of the drum track.
Yeah, I'm kind of sometimes that's happening as a post-production process.
Okay.
It might be like sending mics to echoes, and then those echoes may become like extra drum mics, like they're like, I consider them like part of the track, like the foundation of the drums,
I feel like a good reminder to us too is, again, that like, don't make it too complicated when you want to stay in the flow. It's like, whether we're producing or mixing, a lot of times the best stuff comes to us when it's kind of easy to do.
In some senses, I think you're right. And I think, so much of part of our work is kind of based around trial and error, right? Like
Yeah.
you're making decisions and then you're reacting to them. So it's almost like if you can make those decisions happen quickly and get feedback on them quickly and then react to them quickly, it's just makes the whole process really fun,
Yeah.
And I don't mean that to make a sense of like, oh, I'm not gonna like chase the dragon and go down a wormhole. Like I love wormholes as much as the next guy, but I think it is important to kind of like, you can do that wormhole exploration in small chunks where you're able to react and adjust course, and you end up in a better result, rather than like taking a deep dive and then coming up for air an hour later. You're like, well, what in the world did we just do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, well, and I think part of that too is remembering that there's not just one right answer for making music.
Yeah, exactly.
Like sometimes it can be easy to get stuck on chasing the dragon and going down the wormhole indefinitely, because you're still trying to like compare every answer to each other. And it's like, in the end, all you really need is one really great idea. And then the rest of them, nobody ever heard. So who cares?
Yeah. And that's not to say you shouldn't explore those ideas, but it's like I was saying, it's about trial and error. And, some people, everyone's process is different. Some people may make a decision, think it's awesome, and then just move on and go. Some people might need to make 40 decisions, compare them, and then pick the one. Whatever gets the paint on the canvas, it's all valid. But yeah. To your point.
Yeah, and I like that. Well, and then it's like, even if you're making 40 decisions, find a way where you can still make those decisions quickly. So you can stay in that flow.
Yeah, I think it is important to sort of think quick. Like I was saying, like trial and error, make a decision and react to it. I feel like when I was younger, I definitely would kind of stay in the wormhole a little bit longer. And then the more I did it, I realized it's a lot more beneficial to kind of come up for air more often, make decisions, course correct if I need to, and it just got me to where I wanted to be in a maybe better, more healthy way, I guess.
So, not to put you on the spot about remembering a particular one, but again, a note I had about the Heatherhead Generationals was that it had this filtered intro and then the kind of big sound kicks in. And whether you remember that one or not, I think the concept of a filtered intro kicking into a bigger sound is like, that's one we can all understand for different productions. And I wondered if there were any thoughts you had about that, because a lot of times that does feel kind of like a mixed decision, but I guess it could be also a production move. But like, what are ways to think about this that can be useful? Is it, once again, like screwing the whole mix up 40 different ways and then just pasting them in to see what works? Is it like, do you find that you've got a one button filter thing you can just put on the mix bus and that always works?
Yeah, interesting. I feel like there's definitely a song on that. It might have actually been a song on that record called, so Heatherhead is the name of the album for the listeners out there. There might be a song called Strangers that I think has a similar scenario where the intro is sort of weirdly garbled.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that one, I think that was printed. I think I did print and then put that back in. And I actually have since experimented with ways to do that on the mix bus with like a wrapper plugin that has a wet dry knob, so I can kind of like have a global wet dry for weirdness on the mix bus, which is kind of cool. But yeah, that particular tune was definitely printed, and then
and I think it had that sort of a little bit of that things we learned from DJs element, where it's like, DJs would just filter out, they'd basically have a high, mid, and low EQ on their DJ mixer, and they just filter out the lows on a record and then bring it back in, or filter out the highs and sweep them back up. Madonna had one of her hits was done like that. I forgot the song, maybe it was the DJ track, where it was like the verse, it was just filtered down, and then it just, like, you could hear it just opened up the highs for the chorus, and it's the same groove.
I mean,
and that's such a cool trick,
Yeah, they're like, they're simple. I think at the heart of it, it's about sort of not messing with, I don't want to say messing with, but just sort of like experimenting with the listener's expectations, right? So you're sort of setting up one sort of scenario and get them, like we were talking about the benchmark before. It's like you set up a benchmark for the listener and then you change it as throughout the song, like as the song like kicks in. It's like, oh my gosh, like I thought I was in this one place, turns out I'm in another. It's just like a way to kind of, experiment with their expectations or give them cues. It's like, I don't know, kind of guide them through a tune.
Right. You have to sort of set up the expectations of the song for the listener, and then find a way to maybe just stick to those expectations or break the rules.
Yeah, or mess with them, right? Like maybe the most interesting stuff is when like you're setting, like the classic move going to another really simple but effective move would be, a pullback right before a chorus hits, right? Like you played this entire verse and everybody's like beat 4, there's something happening. The and of 4, there's always something happening. But then on the bar before the chorus, everybody pauses on that 4 and then bam, the chorus, you know what I mean? Like you mess with the expectations that way. And and it makes that following thing that much cooler.
Contrast.
Yeah.
Contrast is a powerful tool in music production.
Definitely.
Well, sometimes I think about bass that way. It's like what makes bass interesting is the moments where there's no bass.
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of a cool thing you can do, like, subtle almost like sleight of hand mixing, right? Like you can pull back the bass a little bit in the lead up to your, say, for example, your chorus, and then give it a little bump right at the start of it. And then that'll feel like you won't necessarily perceive it like, oh, they're turning on the bass, but it's just a subtle sleight of hand that makes the impact even better when the chorus hits, that kind of thing.
Do you feel like all the time that you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all of your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen to this quote from one of our students, David. Quote, "Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mixing process I've ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session." Close quote. Look, I'm so confident that the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass will take your mixes to the next level that if you can't get a killer mix within 30 days, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. So if you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and start now by checking out the free preview of the Ultimate Snare Mixing Trick, and I'll save a seat for you at the front row table at the Grammys. Yeah, there was I believe somebody was talking about mastering, maybe even doing that, where you slowly decrease the stereo level 1 dB from the beginning of the verse to the end of the verse, so that when the chorus hits, it leaps back up again 1 dB.
Yeah, I definitely done that on the stereo fader for sure. In a mix.
Okay.
Like, pull a bridge back or pull a pre-chorus down like a tiny bit over the course of the pre-chorus.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Great tricks, man. You've been doing your homework, Nick. Let's talk about drums a little more. What are some other things that you find really useful in your drum mixing template? What kind of stuff might you have at the ready that's going to be helpful?
Yeah. So I have, similar to the vocals, I have a series of parallels. Some of those parallels are set up to be sent from like individual tracks of the drums, and then there's a few parallels that I like that operate on the kit as a whole. So there's sort of, my routing is built in like that. So I'll have those. If it's meant, so all the drum mics and then the parallels that are meant to work on individual drum mics get fed into a drum sub, and then that drum sub feeds off into any sort of parallel that wants to work on the whole kit as a whole.
Right. Okay. So you might have some stuff that's happening to the kick drum. You might have some stuff that's happening to the snare drum.
Yeah.
Like their own little collection of parallels as well.
Yeah, totally. Like, like a classic kind of, you may want to just send the kick and snare to its own parallel to kind of give more impact to those elements. Mm-hmm. Whereas you don't necessarily want like the room mics sent to that impact thing. But then on the global sort of like full kit parallels, those are more kind of like tones or distortions or compression that I just have found that I like when the full kit is working on them, right? Like when the low end of the kick interacts with that type of parallel and like affects the whole drum kit as a whole. Like there's some effects that I like that, and then there's some where I want it pieced out, so they're in like, I route to them differently.
Do you sometimes have the low end of the kick affect the entire mix, the whole song, or other instruments?
Sometimes. I mean, like, I feel as though inherently I kind of do that the way it hits the SSL stereo bus compressor. Just inevitably, like the low end is working on that, and it can be super cool, if there's a groove and then that low end hits that SSL compressor, and the way that envelope works is kind of like,
Rockstars, you can't see it on the video, but Nick's doing a cool wavy dance with both his hands there.
Yeah.
Because it was like sea eels doing a mating ritual dance or something.
Yeah,
in the deep ocean.
That's how we do it. But, I mean, I feel like, it's funny. Sometimes I love, there's a lot of talk about like, oh, if you filter off the low end to let the compressor work, not be informed by that low frequencies, but it can be really useful sometimes to have those low frequencies, especially if those low frequencies are the pulse of the song. To have that pulse then informs your envelope compression. That's when you start getting that cool stereo bus, especially with the SSL bus compressor. That's where you start to get that groove from the compression, which can be really neat.
Yeah. Nick, once again, is doing the bounce. He's kneading the pizza dough right now.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So parallel stuff for the kick, parallel stuff for the snare. Do toms get anything special? Like I've heard some mixers talk about having a separate reverb send just for the toms, like that. And what about when you want to have that just kaboom verb kind of thing on your snares?
Okay.
What are some ways that you prepare for that?
Yeah. So I think, if I want a kaboom thing, that might be a situation where I pull off to a separate track that feeds the effect, so that I can really tailor that track to feed the effect. Where and it won't. It's not like, my normal drum mics are getting my cohesive drum sound, and then this special effect mic is for the, like you say, like the kaboom snare or something like that, or a special tom thing. Yeah, I'll probably pull that out. But, I definitely, I'll usually at first just try sending it from the track, because like, oh, this will be easy. Let me just automate the send up. And then it's like, oh, it works. Sweet. I can move on. But it's like, oh, not quite there. All right. Well, I got to dig in. I tried the simple method first usually.
Well, so when I said kaboom, that probably implies like the, some occasional dub move or something on the snare.
Okay.
But what about the stuff where it's just like snares seem to have this uncanny need for their own reverb or something like that in a rock track. And then, you get there and sometimes you're like, God, I hate it. Why is it so hard to find? I can hear it in my head, but it's so hard to find something that's fitting.
Yeah.
Do you, is that a fair question to ask? And do you find some things that are useful to making the snare just sound exciting in a cohesive drum mix?
Yes, I do. I think I have a few sort of go-to things. I feel as though sometimes what you're talking about, I may be getting out of some of my full kit parallel, like saturation processes. I sometimes get some ambience out of that kind of gives that excitement. I also have a couple of reverbs in my drums area of the template that are ambient, like just drum ambience that I might feed to get exactly what you're talking about, where you kind of just get like a halo, if you need more of a halo around a kit kind of thing. And so that might get sent from, it all depends at that point. I might send it from the snare mic. I might just add the room mic to the ambience, and that excites it. Sometimes that can actually sound more natural, like if you're sending an ambient mic to additional ambience, it just kind of like gives it more bloom versus like a pa pa kind of thing. But then again, I may do a scenario like, oh, I need to actually just trigger a snare sample that may not be going to the cohesive drum sound, but it may just be tailored sonically to hit a reverb in a way that gets like, maybe I don't want the body of the snare in the reverb, but I do want the sizzle of the snare in the reverb. So I'll like process a sample to be just that, or pull out the the snare mic track, duplicate it, and then process that in a special way to hit that reverb.
Right, and that you might want that effect to be very consistent too, which a sample is good for. Like that's a good way to think of it maybe, is that samples give us consistency in sound if we're wishing we had more of that, and processing gives us more of a, like if we're sending the real snare to a reverb, it'll change a little bit depending on what the snare is doing in those moments.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
And then do you find that part of your drum mixing template will always have sort of like maybe slate trigger on a track ready and waiting if you need it kind of thing?
I do have some triggers ready in the wings just in case. For a kick or in a snare, I have one that's kind of like a subby kick sample for like if I want, more modern extension on the kick. Sometimes I find like I can go into your point about consistency. One thing I like about triggering for that sub extension on the kick is it is really consistent. So, like going down through the rest of your mix and the way it hits the stereo bus, that low end will hit it consistently, which I find is kind of cool. So yeah,
predictability on the low end of our mix is that's like the holy grail.
Yeah, right.
Mixing, right?
So yeah, I do have that. I have another one for kick that is more set up for if I want knock and I can't get the knock I want out of the mics, I may feather in a knock kind of thing. And then I have two other snare trigger tracks that have different samples that I have different, like one is more like a crack kind of sound and one is a more poofy sound and with some top end. And the way I kind of think about all those samples is more, if I can't get what I want out of the mics, I'll just feather in something from a sample to kind of like change the timbre of the drum.
Do you feel like these choices of samples that we might want to include ultimately sort of have to come from our own trial and error? Like we try things and we're like, that did it on this song, and then it becomes part of the collection.
Yeah.
As opposed to this, thinking that, we're gonna discover, the secret CLA snare trigger or whatever. I mean, just to pick an obvious, superstar name out of a hat. Do you feel like some of these things that you've arrived at came from what you learned from somebody in particular, or do you feel like this is like, it really is just a process of like developing your own color palette and then just deciding these are the colors I want to use?
It's more the latter. It's more coming from the colors that I like, or like the way I like to hear music tends to have these colors. So I'll have them ready in case I need them, kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, so yeah, like you said, there's a couple different, I do use slate trigger and it has that, you can load up a couple different samples in the different banks. So I have, for my like knock kick, I may have 4 in there, and then I'll have most of them muted except the one that I usually use. And then if that doesn't work, I'll use it. Or if, for example, going back to your snare bloom question, sometimes that I'll just put a sample of a snare room mic happening, and I'll kind of like tune that, use the tune function to kind of like make it match the snare that's on there. And I may have like a couple, 4 or 5 of those, and like, oh, which room matches this song, or like which pitch of the drum matches this song, that kind of thing.
One of the things I'd point out about that's really handy too is the room sample that you're triggering can actually be too long for the song, but because Trigger has this envelope feature, you can shorten the decay and control the decay of that room. So that makes it really handy for sort of fitting it into a track too.
Yeah, I love that envelope feature. That's like one of my favorite parts of that whole plugin, is just being able to, because I feel like the envelope of the drum can make it, can really make it feel, can change the feel so much. You know what I mean? Like a shorter kick versus a bloomier kick, and you need to, like, depending on the tempo of the song, you may need to to tweak that and, all that kind of stuff.
This podcast is proud to present Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I master my own records using nothing but plugins. Plus, I take you into a world-class mastering studio, Sterling Sound, to meet with Ryan Smith and hear how he professionally mastered my record, Skadoosh, for release to streaming platforms. That's the music you hear on this podcast, Rockstars. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free mixing course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins and Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even upload to your website if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy to get started now. Absolutely. And then again, Rockstars, go listen to Nick's discography because some of the records are just short, punchy as hell kicks and snares, and some of them are like big, wide open, full front head on the kick drum, blooming boom stuff.
Nice.
One of the records, Baseball Bat by the French Cassettes, that's got, I didn't write the songs, apologies. But no, I think Baseball Bat is the song on that one too. Great upright piano sound, great acoustic sound, and great vocals too. But one of the things that I noticed particularly on that, and then I was paying attention to it all across your record, is a great consistency to the bass instrument too. So I wondered if you also had any comments about how you mix bass. Does bass need sometimes a little bit more complex treatment like drums and vocals do to have that steadiness between? An example of things that would piss me off about bass would be I get a bass thinking I like where it's at, and then I listen to it later and I'm like, oh, this note sounds great in the mix. This note disappears, and then this note's too loud, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, like you said before, the even low end is the holy grail, right? Yeah, bass is an interesting one. I mean, but before I get into that, just again, quick shout out to Mackenzie and the guys in French Cassettes, because those, like, their sonic vision was so dialed, and I got to give them total credit. Like, I just helped them get it across the finish line, but their sounds are awesome from the get-go.
Awesome.
Anyway, yeah, low end. Yeah, man, bass. It's tricky. It's funny. Recently, I've actually been trying to simplify my bass approach. I had done some stuff, before, like, oh, let me try parallel with the bass or try setting it to distortion for some better mid-range. And now I'm in like a phase where I just kind of want to try the least amount of stuff to it. and
yeah.
But to the consistency level, or the consistency question, I have the one sort of new thing I've been experimenting with is using soothe just on the bottom frequencies.
Right.
And with a slow release. So it's sort of like, the way that plugin works works really great for that scenario you just described, where you might have a note that's popping out on a bass or a note that disappears. The notches that it can do on that plugin, when you specifically filter it down to just the low end and kind of working slow, and then using that depth control almost as like your, I don't know, I don't want to say makeup gain, but you can kind of use the depth control to how much you want to contain it, basically.
Right. So in other words, it'll treat the wolf tones, the loud notes, it'll push those back down.
Yes.
So that the quieter ones we're able to set it based on the weaker notes, I guess is a way to say it.
Yeah. And I feel like you can do that with a normal traditional multi-band compressor too, or you can, like, even with a regular compressor, sometimes you can you don't need to get fancy with it, because the note like that will stick out will inherently be louder, and that's the thing that triggers the compressor to like pull that one back down. So it's like you don't need to immediately jump to the crazy like notch filter thing, but it definitely is a modern tool that can be useful for that scenario.
Yeah. Do you ever sometimes split frequencies on the bass so that you're like treating mids and up versus lows and lower?
That's really not a gut instinct of mine. I've tried it a few times. I kind of experiment for it, but it's not a gut instinct of mine. And yeah, like I said, right now I'm in this phase of just trying to like
try to do less is more.
Kind of, yeah. I think it comes from just like, I don't know what it comes from, but it's like, I guess maybe I just not been into my bass sounds recently, and I'm like, let me just go back to basics. No pun.
Yeah, well, look at you, go back to basics. I'm sure that you know, the not being into what we're doing anymore is a shared feeling by all of us. I mean, to me, it's the very essence of the drive to continue being creative and try and improve what we do. If we were happy with everything, we'd stop trying to change things and move forward.
Yeah, man, you got to stay curious. And it's such a fun profession to like, there's endless curiosity. You know, each time you peel back a layer of the onion, there's even more fun stuff to figure out in there.
Yeah. Do you have a way of discovering new and interesting music that you go through?
Man, I really rely on my friends for that. I sort of have I have a group of friends that we share tips on like, oh man, did you hear this? Did you hear that? So I don't necessarily do as much detective work on my own these days. I kind of rely on my friends. Sometimes when you spend a day immersed in music, sometimes you want to just go home and not necessarily do some musical detective work.
Yeah.
But
just watch a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, so good excuse to have a cool, a bunch of friends with great taste, right? And then makes it easy for you.
So let me ask you one last question about your discography. You Sleep Tight and I'll Sleep Tight.
Oh yeah,
by Nick Krill. That's a beautiful little track in there. What's the story with this great piano vocal lullaby?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. That's what like my son would say at bedtime. You sleep tight and I'll sleep tight.
That's great.
And then one day, my wife and I just sat at the piano and recorded it, a little tune of it, and then yeah, I think I did it as like a social media post, and then a friend of mine was like, "You just put that on Spotify, man. Like I want to play that for my kid," so I did.
That's great. Was it actually like an iPhone, like a voice memo recording, or is it
the lowest fi thing? Just like
great. Did you do a little bit to it as you release it for Spotify?
I probably did. I probably got the level up, and I probably did a little bit of like mess with the timbre a little bit. And I made it long enough so that it would be accepted on Spotify. Because the first time I posted it, they're like, "You can't do this. It's too short." So I was like, all right. I had more of a fade out to it then.
That's funny. Well, so Rockstars, that's a good takeaway, because if you're ever curious about like, what would it sound like if I just recorded us on the iPhone with voice memo as part of my record? Now you've got an example. It's in the playlist. You Sleep Tight and I'll Sleep Tight. You can go listen to it. You can hear what it's going to sound like if you let that be your $10,000 mic. I guess it'd be your $1,000 mic.
Yeah, I feel like it fits. It's just, it's what it is. It was a natural occurrence, and it kind of feels like it's charming in a way to be kind of grotty.
It is. All right. So this last question, Nick, is hypothetical. You've been here before. We're going to take you there again.
Mm-hmm.
We're taking the Wayback Studio machine, and you get to go back in time and find young Nick Krill. I don't know if you're finding Nick before he started the Spinto Band or at the tail end of the Spinto Band, but you're going to give yourself one bit of advice, and you say, here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice do you want to go back and give yourself?
I would say to search out some mentors sooner than I did. I feel like I had friends who are in recording, like obviously like you and Robin included, but like a real kind of more intense mentor-mentee relationship is something I've really only started exploring in the last few years, and found it's really, really valuable. Um, so I would say I would try and search that out sooner. Shout out to, yeah, like I mentioned John Paterno before. Another friend of mine, Damian Taylor, is like really
Damian's
cool
awesome.
sounding board, and studio stuff and sort of life studio business perspective kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it would just be that. It would be search out some mentor relationships sooner, just to like get more perspective on the world of recording and business of recording, the life of recording. It's such and working in this field and being, a solo freelancer, like running your own small business is it's such a, I don't know how to describe it. It's humongous. It's like so many interlocking facets of life, and to kind of like get perspective on all of those, I think you need to have outside people say, hey, did you ever think about this? Like, you really love your mix template, but hey man, did you look over here at this thing? This is kind of important too. You know what I mean? It's like that kind of thing. It's just really valuable.
Well, and then things change too, because, if you get older and maybe you get married and have kids, and then those become parts of your questions about intermingling with a life of recording too.
Yeah.
So it's great to have known you for that long too, Nick. And it's really awesome to have you on the show with us. And thank you for joining us and sharing all these awesome insights into mixing. Now I'm going to hang, as soon as we're done, I'm going to rush down to the studio and be like, oh, what did you say? I got to put that into my mix template. Let the rock stars know how they can go find you online. If they've got a record that just desperately needs an amazing mix, or they just got questions for you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I have a website, nickkrill.com. That's pretty one-stop shop. I have an Instagram account that is Nick_Krill, where you can sort of follow along if I post little session things here and there. I say those are the two top zones. Yeah, awesome. My website, you can email me directly. Happy to talk to anyone.
Awesome. And I did notice there was another Nick Krill on Instagram, but you're not the one holding the giant fish in the photo.
No, that's not me.
Awesome.
I'm holding the memory.
Thanks for hanging with us, man. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening.
It's so fun to talk to you. It's so fun to have known you all these years, and an honor to be on the show again. I really love what you're doing. Just sort of an oral history of music making is such a cool little document to have. So it's an honor to be a part of it.
It only exists because you're willing to be here and talk to us for 2 hours. So we really appreciate it, man.
Hey, I love talking about studios, man. You can't stop me.
You can't stop me. All right. Good to see you, dude.
Take it easy, man.
Cheers.
See ya.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our awesome sponsors who help make this episode possible: Grace Design, Atom Audio, Native Instruments, and Isotope. And remember, at isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plugin purchase. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, please check out our sponsors using the links in our show notes, because it's a great way to help support this show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars: Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and Liz Hulitskaya. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.